I was driving my rusted-out Toyota Corolla, which somehow still had working speakers, despite everything else about it falling apart. Jess sat shotgun, feet up on the dashboard, scrolling through her phone and occasionally smacking me on the arm to show me memes I couldn't look at. Behind us were Kyle, Luke, and Rachel, crammed together in the back seat. Kyle was holding a styrofoam cup filled with God knows what, leaning forward between the seats. He was the type of guy who always looked like he was about to tell you something you wouldn't want to hear, but would laugh at anyway. Luke, on the other hand, was quieter. Big into hiking and survival stuff, he'd been our nature guy ever since Jess declared we needed one. Rachel was the calm one, always keeping us grounded when things got chaotic, which they always did with Jess and Kyle around. Honestly, the drive wasn't bad. The weather was perfect, blue skies, a slight breeze, and the road twisted and turned through some of the prettiest landscapes I'd ever seen. We passed a few scattered houses, but eventually those gave way to dense forests. By the time we reached the gravel road leading to the camp, it felt like we'd stepped out of reality and into some beautifully forgotten corner of the world. When we finally saw the camp sign, wooden and faded, with the words Blackpine Camp barely visible, we cheered. I pulled the car into the gravel lot, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled like pine and earth, cool and clean, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The car doors slammed shut one after another, the echoes swallowed by the surrounding forest. Jess stretched dramatically, her flannel shirt riding up slightly as she groaned. God, I think my legs forgot how to work. Cry me a river, Kyle said, tossing his cup into a nearby trash bin. Try sitting in the middle seat for 3 hours. I'm 90% elbows right now. Rachel pulled out a laminated camp map. Okay, according to this, the main cabin is just up that path. That's where we'll find the supply closet and, hopefully, coffee. Coffee's priority one, huh? Luke asked, adjusting his backpack straps. Obviously. You don't want me uncaffeinated, trust me, Rachel replied with a soft smirk. Blackpine Camp looked like something out of a postcard, at least at first glance. The cabins were rustic but sturdy, sitting in a semicircle around a gravel clearing with a fire pit in the middle. Beyond that, there were trees as far as the eye could see, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Kyle was the first to break the silence. Okay, where's the creepy guy with the hook for a hand? He's late. Shut up, Kyle, Jess said, rolling her eyes. She walked toward the largest cabin, the one that looked like it might have been an old mess hall. This place does have some serious summer camp horror movie vibes, though. I'm into it. Great, I said. That's exactly the energy we need. Jess summoning Jason Voorhees on day one. I'm just saying, Jess shot back, pushing the door open and peeking inside. If I hear one creepy noise tonight, I'm leaving you all behind. Noted, I said, following her in. The inside smelled like wood and dust, with beams of sunlight cutting through the cracks in the old shutters. There were rows of long wooden tables, most of them covered in cobwebs. Kyle wandered in behind us, kicking at one of the benches. I'm digging this. Less digging, more cleaning, Rachel said, stepping into the room with a bucket and a mop she'd found in one of the supply sheds. The sooner we get this place livable, the sooner we can relax. We spent the next couple of hours splitting up and tackling different parts of the camp. Luke cleared debris from the fire pit, while Rachel started scrubbing down the mess hall. Kyle and Jess worked on organizing the sleeping cabins, which were just as dusty as the mess hall, but surprisingly intact. That left me in charge of unloading the food and gear. As I lugged a cooler toward the mess hall, I spotted Jess standing in the doorway of one of the cabins, her arms crossed. Hey, she called out. Come look at this. What is it? I asked, setting the cooler down and walking over. She gestured inside the cabin. Tell me this isn't weird. I stepped in and saw what she meant immediately. Hanging from the ceiling was a small bundle of sticks and feathers, tied together with an old piece of string. It looked handmade. "Huh," I said, reaching up to touch it. "Don't touch it," Jess said, slapping my hand away. "Why not?" "Because it's creepy as hell, and I don't want you activating some ancient curse or something while I'm standing here." "It's probably just a decoration," I said. "Yeah, sure," she said, narrowing her eyes. "When I'm gone, you can deal with it. I'm not sleeping in here if that thing's still hanging." Before I could respond, Kyle stuck his head in the door. "Hey, lovebirds, quit slacking. Luke says the fire pit's ready." "We're not slacking," Jess snapped, shoving past him. "And I'm not a lovebird." Kyle grinned. "Whatever you say." We regrouped by the fire pit just as the sun started to dip below the trees. Luke had set up a circle of old camp chairs, and Rachel had brought out a bag of marshmallows she'd found in our gear. "See?" Kyle said, holding up a marshmallow on a stick. "This is the life. No cell service, no responsibilities, just us and nature." The fire was dying down when the first weird noise reached us. At first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, low and faint. None of us said anything about it, too caught up in the moment. Kyle had been telling some ridiculous story about a haunted amusement park, waving his arms around like the over-enthusiastic camp counselor he was born to be. And then the clown's head just... he clapped his hands together. Pops right off, blood everywhere. "Nice," Jess said, throwing a marshmallow at him. "Way to kill the vibe." "Come on, that was gold," Kyle replied, catching the marshmallow midair. "You're just mad you don't have my storytelling skills." "I think I'm mad that you exist," Jess shot back, laughing. "Guys, shh," Rachel interrupted, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" We all froze. For a moment, there was only the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirp of crickets. Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic mumbling, almost like someone talking to themselves. It was coming from the direction of the wood line, just beyond the clearing. "What is that?" Luke asked, leaning forward. "Wind?" I said, though I wasn't sure. "No way," Jess muttered, standing up. "That's a voice. Someone's out there." "Yeah, like a serial killer or something," Kyle joked, though his nervous chuckle gave him away. Rachel shook her head. "No, seriously, we need to check this out. What if it's someone who needs help? Or someone who's gonna murder us?" Kyle added. Jess rolled her eyes and grabbed one of the flashlights. "Shut up. We'll never know unless we look. Don't be a baby, Kyle." Reluctantly, we all grabbed whatever makeshift weapons we could find, firewood, long sticks, and followed Jess toward the sound. It grew louder as we neared the edge of the clearing, the mumbling taking on an unsettling rhythm. It was almost hypnotic, rising and falling in a set of odd jitters and cooing. We swept our flashlights around once the noise felt like it was in our ears. That's when we saw her. She was crawling through the dirt, hunched over like some wounded animal. The beam of Luke's flashlight caught her pale, wrinkled skin, and we froze. She was completely naked, her body thin and frail, the bones of her shoulders and hips jutting out like they were trying to escape her skin. Her hair was gray and stringy, hanging in uneven clumps around her face. "Jesus Christ," Jess whispered. "Is she okay? Does she look okay?" Kyle hissed. Rachel took a cautious step forward. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman didn't react. She kept crawling, her hands digging into the dirt as she mumbled to herself. Her voice was low and guttural, the words slurring together in a way that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. "Ma'am?" Rachel tried again, louder this time. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. Luke swung the flashlight to her face, but she didn't even flinch. Her eyes were wide and glassy, staring blankly ahead as if we weren't even there. "Maybe she's deaf," Jess whispered, her voice tight. "She's naked," Kyle said, his voice rising slightly. Why the hell is she naked? Stop, Rachel said sharply. She stepped closer, holding her hands out like she was approaching a scared animal. Hey, it's okay. We're not going to hurt you. Can you tell us what's wrong? The woman suddenly stopped crawling, freezing in place. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then, she slowly turned her head toward Rachel. Holy shit, Jess breathed. The woman's face was pale and sunken, her cheekbones sharp under her paper-thin skin. Her mouth hung open slightly, and for a brief, horrible moment, I thought she might smile. But she didn't. She just stared, her glassy eyes unfocused and empty. Rachel took a step back. Okay, maybe we should... Before she could finish, the woman turned away and began crawling again, dragging herself into the tree line. Ma'am, wait! Rachel called after her, but the woman didn't stop. Her mumbling resumed, louder now, her bony hands clawing at the ground as she disappeared into the darkness. What the fuck was that? Kyle said, his voice shaking. I don't know, Luke said, lowering the flashlight. But I don't think we should follow her. Follow her? Jess snapped. Who the hell said anything about following her? Rachel looked like she was about to argue, but then she glanced back at the woods and seemed to think better of it. We can't just leave her out there. She's gone, I said firmly. And whatever's going on with her, it's not something we can deal with. Let's just go back to the cabin and figure this out in the morning. No one argued. We hurried back to the fire pit, leaving the woods behind, but the air felt heavier after that, like the trees were forming a wall around us. By the time we reached the cabin, no one was talking. Inside, we locked the door and sat in silence for a while, listening for any sign of the woman. But the woods outside were silent. Morning came too quickly, dragging with it the kind of exhaustion that no amount of coffee or sunlight could shake. None of us said much at breakfast. The memory of the woman, the way she crawled, the way she looked right through us, hung over the table. Kyle poked at his cold eggs with a plastic fork. So, is no one gonna talk about the naked grandma in the woods? Or are we just pretending last night didn't happen? Jess shot him a glare. I think we all saw it, Kyle. You don't have to be an ass about it. I'm just saying, he muttered. That wasn't normal. People don't just do that. She could have been sick, Rachel offered. Maybe she wandered off from somewhere. From where? Luke asked, leaning back in his chair. We're in the middle of nowhere. Closest house is what, 20 miles? Guys, can we not? I said, rubbing my temples. Let's just get through today. Maybe she was some random drifter and she's long gone by now. Jess snorted. Yeah, sure. Long gone. Totally normal behavior to crawl around naked and mumble in the dirt before just taking off. The rest of that day, we split up to tackle more of the cleanup. But the air around camp felt different, thicker somehow. It wasn't just the woman, it was everything. The woods, the cabins, even the sky. It was like a strange type of stillness. By mid-morning, I was clearing brush from the trail near the cabins when I found it. A small bundle of sticks, feathers, and animal bones tied together with frayed red string. It was hanging from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. What the hell is this? I muttered, staring up at it. Found one too? Luke's voice startled me, and I turned to see him walking up the trail towards me. They're everywhere, he said. I've counted 5 so far. Jess found one tied to the side of a cabin, and Rachel's freaking out. I reached up to take the one hanging in front of me, but Luke grabbed my wrist. Don't, he said, his voice low. Just don't touch it. Why? Because it's creepy as hell, that's why. You don't mess with stuff like this. Jess appeared behind him, holding up a bundle in her hand. So what do we do? Just leave them here? Hope the arts and crafts witches don't come back for round 2? She extended out her arm to look at the twigs. I was on your page before, Luke, but these things got to go. We need to tell someone, Rachel said, jogging up the trail to join us. She was pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. These things weren't here yesterday, and I already took down a few with Kyle. Someone's been here. Yeah, no shit, Jess said. Probably the same someone who was crawling around last night. Stop, I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. We don't know what's going on, but freaking out isn't going to help. Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but before she could say anything, Kyle called out from the direction of the cabins. Guys? You might want to see this. We followed his voice to the fire pit, where he was crouched over something on the ground. As we got closer, I saw what he was looking at. A strange symbol etched into the dirt. It was a perfect circle with jagged lines radiating out from the center, almost like a sunburst. It's fresh, Kyle said, tracing the edge of the symbol with his finger. I checked the fire pit last night before bed. This wasn't here. Okay, great, Jess said, throwing her hands up. So now we've got creepy symbols, freaky art projects, and a naked lady crawling around in the woods. Are we sure this isn't some elaborate prank? Like, are there hidden cameras somewhere? If it's a prank, it's a damn good one, Luke muttered. Rachel shook her head. I don't think this is a joke. I think we're being warned. Warned about what? Kyle asked, standing up. Rachel didn't answer. She just looked back at the woods, her face pale and drawn. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. None of us wanted to stray too far from the cabins, but staying close didn't feel much better. Every noise, every shadow in the trees, set my nerves on edge. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, we were all on edge. The strange symbols, the bundles, the oppressive silence of the woods. It was all adding up to something. I caught Jess glancing over her shoulder as we walked back to the cabin for dinner. Do you think she's still out there? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew the truth. When we finished dinner, if you could call microwaved instant noodles a dinner, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. Nobody wanted to admit they were scared, but the way Jess kept glancing at the windows and how Kyle wouldn't put down the fire poker spoke volumes. We tried to distract ourselves with a card game, but it didn't help much. Every shuffle of the deck sounded unnaturally loud. 3 of a kind, Jess said, slapping her cards on the table. Pay up, losers. Kyle groaned and flicked a peanut at her. You're cheating. I know it. I don't need to cheat to beat you, Kyle, Jess said, smirking, though her eyes darted toward the window again. Rachel stood abruptly, wringing her hands. I can't do this anymore. Do what? Luke asked. Pretend everything's fine. It's not fine. There's something wrong here. The symbols, the bundles, the woman. This whole place feels off. Great, Kyle said, tossing his cards on the table. Let's all panic. That'll totally fix everything. She's not wrong, though, Jess said, her voice softer. It's not just her. You all feel it, don't you? Nobody answered, but the silence was enough. And then, something changed. It started faint, just like the night before. Low, rhythmic mumbling, drifting through the trees. My stomach twisted as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the same as last night. It wasn't one voice this time. It was many. Tell me that's the wind, Jess said, her voice trembling. It's not the wind, Luke muttered, already reaching for the flashlight. We crowded by the window, staring out into the dark. The fire pit was barely visible in the faint moonlight, but beyond it, a figure moved. At first, it was hard to make out, shadows shifting just outside the clearing. But as the mumbling grew louder, The shadows stepped into the open. They were old women. At least, they looked like old women. They moved slowly, shuffling in uneven steps, their heads low and their shoulders hunched. The firelight caught their faces, wrinkled, pale and blank, like the woman from the night before. There were 4 of them, all muttering under their breath in that same strange, guttural language. "What the hell?" Kyle whispered, backing away from the window. "Are they—" Rachel started, but her voice broke. "They're old," Jess said, gripping the edge of the table. The women didn't seem to notice us. They shuffled around the fire pit, their muttering rising and falling like some bizarre chant. One of them stopped and tilted her head back, her mouth opening wide as if she was screaming, but no sound came out. "We should go out there," Rachel said suddenly. "Are you insane?" Jess snapped. "Did you not see what happened last night? We don't go near them." "They're just women," Rachel said, though her voice was shaking. "What if they're lost? What if they're not lost?" Luke said firmly. "Look at them. Does that seem lost to you?" We all turned back to the window. The women had started to move again, this time heading toward the woods. One of them paused at the edge of the trees and turned, staring directly at the cabin. I felt my breath catch. Her eyes were blank and milky, her expression slack. But somehow, I felt her looking through the cabin, like she could see us, see me. "Close the curtains," I whispered. Jess moved quickly, yanking the curtains shut and plunging the cabin into darkness. We all stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of our own breathing and the muffled murmurs of the women outside. After what felt like an eternity, the mumbling began to fade. "They're leaving," Luke said, his voice barely audible. Nobody moved until the forest fell silent again. Even then, we stayed huddled together in the center of the room, too afraid to speak. Eventually, Kyle broke the silence. "So, we're all just gonna pretend that was normal, right?" "Shut up, Kyle," Jess said, but her voice wavered. None of us slept that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was over. But deep down, I knew the women would be back. None of us spoke much the next morning either. We sat around the cabin's small dining table, sipping instant coffee and avoiding each other's eyes. The daylight felt weaker than it should have, like the sun was trying to push through some hidden barrier. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see one of those women standing in the clearing. "We have to leave," Rachel said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was hoarse, her face pale. "Today, right now." Jess nodded, barely touching her coffee. "Yeah, this place is messed up. I don't care if the camp leader gets mad. We're leaving." "Fine by me," Kyle muttered. "Let's pack up and get the hell out of here." Luke set his mug down and rubbed his temples. "Okay, but what's the plan? The car can only take so much gear, do we?" "We'll figure it out," Rachel interrupted. "We'll leave the camping supplies or whatever. We just have to—" A loud metallic clang echoed through the cabin, cutting her off. Everyone froze. "What the hell was that?" Jess whispered. "Sounded like it came from the car," Luke said, standing quickly. We all grabbed whatever we could find, flashlights, a crowbar, a broom, and headed outside. The clearing was empty, but the sound had definitely come from the direction of the parking area. When we reached the car, my stomach dropped. Both tires on the driver's side were slashed, deflated into sad, crumpled shapes against the gravel. A long, jagged tear ran down each one, as though something sharp and deliberate had ripped through them. "Jesus Christ," Jess muttered. "Not just that," Luke said, crouching near the hood. He pointed to a pool of dark liquid spreading under the car. They cut the fuel line, too. Kyle kicked at a rock, cursing under his breath. Are you kidding me? Who the hell does this? The women, Rachel said, her voice trembling. It was them. It has to be. Jess threw up her hands. Okay, great. So now we're stranded in fucked town. What do we do now? We wait, Luke said firmly, standing up. The camp leader's supposed to show up tomorrow morning, right? That's, what, 24 hours? We can survive one more night. One more night? Rachel's voice cracked. Did you see what they were doing out there? What if they come back? What if they don't leave this time? We don't have a choice, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We're not walking 20 miles through the woods with no cell service. We stay, and we stick together. Jess looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she folded her arms and stared at the ground. Fine, but I'm not just standing here like a sitting duck. We're boarding this place up. We spent the rest of the day trying to stay busy. Luke and Kyle boarded up the windows in the cabins while Jess and I gathered firewood. Rachel sat by the radio, twisting the knobs in vain, trying to pick up a signal. We should have left yesterday, she said when I came back inside. I didn't argue. She was right. As the afternoon wore on, the unease grew worse. None of us wanted to stray too far from the cabin, but being inside felt claustrophobic. The woods seemed darker than they should have been. At one point, Jess found another bundle laying near the fire pit. This one bigger than the others, with what looked like a tuft of animal fur tied to it. We didn't touch that one. By the time the sun started to set, we were all back in the main cabin, our nerves frayed and our tempers short. Okay, Luke said. If they show up again, we stick to the plan. Stay together, stay inside, and don't open the door. What if they break in? Kyle asked, his voice unsteady. They won't, Luke said, though he didn't sound convinced. We'll be fine. Nobody believed him. The sky outside darkened. I could feel it in my bones. The night was coming. It started with the wind. The shutters rattled, and the trees outside groaned like they were on the verge of snapping. Luke had locked and barred the doors earlier in the evening, and we'd shoved the cabin's 2 flimsy tables against them for good measure. But none of it felt like enough. Rachel was still by the radio, twisting the knobs in a desperate, silent plea for a signal. Jess was in the corner, gripping a kitchen knife she'd dug out of the supply shed, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Kyle sat on the floor, gripping the fire poker so tightly his knuckles had gone white. What time is it? Jess finally asked, breaking the silence. Late, Luke said. He was crouched by the window, keeping an eye on the clearing through a crack in the boarded shutters. Jess laughed bitterly. Great. Super helpful. Thanks, Luke. Cut it out, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to stay calm. Calm? She snapped. Did you miss the part where we're trapped in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of psycho witches who slashed our tires and cut our fuel line? You want me to calm down? I want you to stop freaking everyone out. Before Jess could respond, Luke held up a hand. Quiet. We all froze, every muscle in my body locking up as I strained to hear what he did. At first, there was nothing but the wind and the groaning trees, and then I heard it. The sound I'd been dreading since the sun set. The chanting. It started faint, like it had the night before, but this time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was closer. Much closer. Jesus Christ, Rachel whispered. They're here, Luke said, his voice flat. We crowded around the window, peeking out through the cracks. The fire pit at the center of the clearing glowed faintly with embers we thought had died hours ago. Figures moved in the shadows around it, their bodies lithe and jerky, like crows being yanked on leash. They were the same women from the previous night, or whatever was left of them. Their skin hung loose and torn, the raw pink flesh underneath glistening in the firelight. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes milky and empty, but their mouths moved in a synchronized rhythm, muttering words that didn't belong to any language I'd ever heard. One of them bent backward at an impossible angle, her head lolling unnaturally to one side as her voice grew louder. Another dragged something heavy behind her, a burlap sack that squirmed and bled onto the dirt. "Are those—" Kyle started, but his voice trailed off, his face ashen. The women moved with purpose, dragging the sack toward the fire pit. One reached into it and pulled out a struggling, writhing animal. A rabbit, I think. The woman held it high above her head, her muttering rising to a fever pitch, and then she ripped it open with her bare hands. Rachel let out a choked sob and stumbled back from the window, but I couldn't look away. Blood poured down the woman's arms, thick and dark, pooling at her feet. She flung the carcass into the fire, where it hissed and popped, filling the air with the sickening stench of burning flesh. The chanting grew louder, more aggressive. The other women followed suit, pulling more animals from the sack, mangled rabbits, a squirrel, something I couldn't even identify, and spilling their blood into the flames. "Stop watching," Jess hissed, grabbing my arm and yanking me back from the window. "We need to do something." "Do what?" Kyle said, his voice breaking. "What the hell are we supposed to do against that?" "We can't just sit here," Jess snapped. "They haven't come for us yet," Luke said quietly, his eyes still glued to the window. "We stay inside. We stay quiet. Maybe they'll—" He trailed off, but we all knew how that sentence was supposed to end. "Maybe they'll leave." The fire in the clearing roared higher, throwing long, flickering shadows across the trees. One of the women began to scream, not in pain, but in what sounded like triumph. Her voice was guttural, inhuman, rising above the others as she threw her arms wide and tipped her head back to the sky. The others joined in, their bodies contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Bones cracked, joints twisted, and yet they didn't stop moving. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside me, vibrating in my skull, in my chest, in the marrow of my bones. And then, one of them stopped. She turned slowly, her head snapping unnaturally to one side, and stared directly at the cabin. "They know we're here," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. The woman stepped forward, her movements erratic and uneven. Another followed her, and then another. They moved toward us, their eyes gleaming white in the firelight, their mouths still muttering. "Get away from the window," Luke ordered, but I was already backing up. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, until it was deafening. I could feel it in my teeth, in my ribs. My vision blurred, and for a second I thought I might pass out. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. "They're not coming inside," Jess said, her voice trembling but defiant. "They're not—" A sharp, heavy thud against the door cut her off. We all froze, staring at the door, which buckled slightly under the impact. Another thud followed, and then another, each one louder and more violent. "They're trying to break in," Rachel whimpered. Luke grabbed the crowbar from the floor and stepped in front of the door. "Stay back," he said, his voice hard but shaking. The thudding stopped, and then, from the other side of the door, came a low, rasping voice. "Let us in." It wasn't a question. It was a demand. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, but my feet were rooted to the floor. "Don't move," Luke whispered. "Don't say anything." The voice came again, louder this time and closer. "Let us in." The firelight outside flickered, and I could see their shadows through the cracks in the shutters. They were everywhere, surrounding the cabin, waiting. The pounding on the door stopped. For a moment, the only sounds were our shaky breaths, and the faint crackle of the fire outside. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Jess was clutching the kitchen knife, like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Kyle held the fire poker, standing frozen near the window. "They're gone," Rachel whispered, though her voice shook with disbelief. "They're gone." Luke didn't move from the door. They're not. As if in answer, the window behind us shattered. Glass exploded inward, and Jess screamed as something long and clawed reached through, swiping at the air. The hand, or whatever it was pale and thin, its skin sagging off the bones like wet paper. "Get back!" Luke yelled, swinging the crowbar and slamming it against the frame. The creature retracted its arm with a guttural hiss. "Block it! Block the window!" Kyle shouted, grabbing a chair and slamming it against the broken pane. Before we could catch our breath, another window shattered. Then another. The sound was deafening, each break followed by the relentless muttering and scratching of those things, clawing at the cabin's defenses. "They're everywhere!" Jess screamed, backing toward the corner of the room. "Basement!" Luke shouted, pointing toward the trapdoor near the kitchen. "We can barricade ourselves down there." We scrambled for the trapdoor, Rachel practically dragging me as my legs felt like lead. Jess was already there, yanking it open and shoving the others through. "Hurry!" she yelled. Kyle went next, followed by Rachel. Luke shoved me toward the opening. "Go!" I climbed down the creaking ladder into the damp, dark basement. The air smelled like mildew and old dirt. Rachel fumbled with her flashlight, casting jagged beams of light across the low, claustrophobic space. Luke followed, slamming the trapdoor shut above him, just as another crash rang out from the cabin. Something heavy landed on the floor above us, followed by the sharp scrape of claws against wood. We all huddled in the corner, our backs pressed against the cold stone wall. The room was deathly silent except for the sound of our breathing. For a moment, I thought maybe we were safe. Then we heard the trapdoor creak. "No," Jess whispered, gripping the knife so tightly her hand was shaking. "No, no, no." The door groaned, the wood splintering as something heavy pressed against it. The muttering was louder now, filling the room like a dozen bell chimes. And then the trapdoor shattered. The first one dropped into the basement with a sickening crunch. Her legs bent the wrong way when she landed, but she didn't seem to notice. Her skin hung off her frame in wet, rotting folds, and her milky eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Jess lunged forward, slashing with the knife, but the hag moved unnaturally fast, twisting around her strike and slamming her to the ground. Jess screamed as claws raked across her chest, tearing through her shirt and skin like paper. "Get off her!" Kyle roared, charging forward with the fire poker. He swung hard, cracking the hag across the face, but it barely fazed her. She turned on him, her jaw unhinging to reveal jagged, yellowed teeth. More of them dropped into the basement, their movements jerky and inhuman. The room filled with chaos, screams, growls, the wet sound of flesh tearing. "Run!" Luke shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the far corner of the basement, where a narrow crawl space led into the foundations. I stumbled, nearly tripping over something soft and warm. I didn't want to look, but my eyes betrayed me. Jess lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath her as one of the hags dragged her limp body toward the trapdoor. "No!" I shouted, reaching for her, but Luke yanked me back. "She's gone!" he yelled. "We have to go!" I couldn't process it. Couldn't believe it. Jess, the loudest, most assertive of us, was gone. Rachel was next. As we crawled through the tight, damp tunnel, she let out a choked gasp. "No, get off me!" I turned in time to see one of the hags clawing at her ankle, dragging her backward. Her screams were cut short as another hag appeared behind her, grabbing her hair and yanking her into the darkness. "Rachel!" I screamed, but Luke shoved me forward. "Keep moving," he hissed. The crawl space opened into a wider section of the foundation, the walls damp and crumbling. Kyle was there, clutching his arm, which hung at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "They're everywhere," he mumbled. "We can't. There's too many of them." Luke crouched beside him, shaking him by the shoulders. "Stay with me. We're going to make it." Before Kyle could respond, a shrill, unnatural scream echoed through the foundation. The light from Rachel's discarded flashlight flickered, and I saw them. The hags poured into the space, their twisted bodies moving unnaturally fast, their claws raking the walls as they closed in. Kyle let out a ragged yell and lunged forward, swinging the fire poker with his good arm. He hit one of the creatures, but another slammed into him from the side, sending him sprawling. I didn't see what happened next. I didn't want to. Luke grabbed my hand and pulled me into a narrow crack in the foundation. We pressed ourselves into the tight space, the cold stone digging into my back. "Don't move," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of claws scraping stone and the wet, gurgling screams of our friends. The hags moved through the space, sniffing the air, their muttering filling the cracks in my skull. One of them stopped inches from our hiding spot, its head jerking toward us. I held my breath, praying it couldn't see us. It tilted its head, its hollow eyes scanning the darkness. For one horrible moment, I thought it would reach for us. But then it turned and disappeared into the shadows. The screams stopped. Luke and I stayed in that crack for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. The muttering faded, replaced by the distant whisper of wind through wood. When we finally crawled out, the basement was empty. The walls were splattered with blood, and the air reeked of copper and decay. Jess, Kyle, Rachel, they were gone. The basement was silent, the kind of silent that makes your ears ring. My legs were cramping from how long Luke and I had been wedged into the crack in the foundation, but I didn't dare move. Neither of us did. I stared at the floor in front of me, trying not to focus on the blood spattered across the stone or the claw marks gouged into the walls. My mind was fractured, cycling through images of Jess's limp body, Rachel's screams, and the wet, sickening sounds of what they did to Kyle. I didn't realize I was crying until Luke touched my arm. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, and his eyes were hollow. He didn't speak. He just pointed to the faint sliver of light filtering in from the broken trapdoor above. "They're gone," he mouthed, his voice too weak to form actual words. I shook my head. "You don't know that," I whispered, though my voice cracked. "I do," he insisted, his voice barely audible. "Listen." I forced myself to listen. The hags' guttural muttering, the scraping of their claws, the screaming, they were gone. Luke reached out slowly, testing the air. When nothing happened, he motioned for me to follow. It took everything I had to crawl out of the crack. My body felt heavy, my arms and legs trembling as if they weren't mine. The basement felt smaller than it had before, every corner soaked in death. Luke and I climbed the broken remains of the ladder and pushed the trap door open cautiously. The cabin was destroyed. Furniture was overturned, the walls gouged and broken, and the floorboards were slick with blood. I tried not to look too closely at the stains, at what was left of our friends. "Keep moving," Luke muttered, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop." We stepped into the clearing. The fire pit was still smoldering, the embers casting long, flickering shadows across the camp. The bundles of sticks and feathers were scattered across the ground, soaked in what I hoped was water but knew wasn't. There was no sign of the hags. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I almost cried. The pale yellow glow didn't feel real, like it was some cruel hallucination meant to lure us deeper into the nightmare. But the further we walked, the brighter it became, and then we heard the rumbling of a truck. It was parked just off the dirt road, a beat-up old thing with the camp's logo painted on the side. The camp leader's truck. Luke broke into a run, shouting and waving his arms, but I hung back, my legs refusing to move. I watched as the door opened and the man stepped out, his face wrinkled and weathered, but undeniably human. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you kids?" the camp leader asked, his voice thick with concern. Luke fell to his knees, gasping for breath. "They're dead," he said, his voice cracking. "They're all dead." The man's face fell. He rushed over to me, his hands on my shoulders, as he asked me what happened. I couldn't answer. Luke told him everything, his words tumbling out in a frantic, jumbled mess. The camp leader's face grew darker with every sentence, his eyes darting toward the woods as if he expected the hags to come bursting out at any moment. "We're leaving," he said finally. "Now." He drove us into town, where the police and paramedics were waiting. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, being wrapped in a blanket, answering questions I didn't have answers to, the way they looked at us like we were crazy. They searched the camp. They didn't find anything. No bodies, no blood, not even a single claw mark. The police said it was a trauma response, that we'd imagined things in the chaos of the night. But I know what I saw, what I heard. They're still out there,